really appreciate your coming out tonight. I'm sure there are a lot of things you'd rather do than come out and listen to me speak on the Federal Reserve System. In fact, it's a little confusing because I know from talking to a few of you earlier that you know all about this topic. I mean, you're asking me questions, well, don't you think so-and-so? And I realize that many of you here are quite well informed on the Federal Reserve System, and I really can't figure out why you came out, unless it was to figure out if I knew anything about it. So it makes me a little bit uneasy, but nevertheless, I've done my homework, so I'll see what I can do. It's a big topic, and it's complex, or seemingly complex, so I think the best way to begin is just to begin. I'm going to jump in, splash around a little bit, and see how far I can get. And I think the best place to begin is historically. That always baffles them. You know, when you go back in history, it sounds very profound. So let's go all the way back to the 1st century B.C. It was in that century that a rather obscure philosopher by the name of Epictetus, who lived in the kingdom of Phrygia, had this to say. He said, appearances are of 4 kinds. Things either are as they appear to be, or they neither are nor appear to be, or they are but do not appear to be, or they are not and yet appear to be. Everybody got that? There'll be a quiz on that in a few minutes. Actually, I was convinced after I read that if Epictetus had been alive today, he surely would have been a Harvard professor of banking and probably would have written the definitive textbook on the Federal Reserve System. Because what Epictetus did is what so many modern economists and experts in the field of banking do, and that is he took a rather simple concept and made it sound very, very profound and complicated. All Epictetus was saying basically was that appearances can be deceiving. So what's the big deal about that? We all know that. We didn't need the intellectual to tell us that. And I thought that that would be a good way to approach this topic tonight. Appearances indeed can be deceiving. And with regard to the Federal Reserve System in particular, we're talking about appearances of the 4th kind, which is those things which are not and yet appear to be. Appearances of the 4th kind is the theme of my presentation this evening. Well, okay, with that by way of a running start on this subject, I'd like to give you what I think are 7 good reasons to abolish the Federal Reserve System. When I went through this topic for the first time, the way I organize things is I try not to, in advance, determine what it is I'm going to say or in what sequence. Just read everything I can find, gather it together, make photocopies of various things, and then the last stage is to sort those photocopies out into stacks and try and see if there are divisions of material. And generally when that is done, you begin to see some kind of form to the work emerge from these stacks. And when I was done, I had basically 7 stacks of papers. And when I analyzed what was in those stacks, I realized that these were reasons to abolish the Federal Reserve System. And so here they are. Number 1, it is incapable of accomplishing its stated objectives. 2, it is a cartel operating against the public interest. 3, it is the supreme instrument of usury. 4, it generates our most unfair tax. 5, it encourages war. 6, it destabilizes the economy. And 7, it is an instrument of totalitarianism. Now, I have stated those in the most shocking form that I knew how, right to the point, to try and jar our thinking loose on this. I think you must agree that they're rather extreme statements. And certainly if evidence could be shown that any one of them was true, it would be, I think, cause to abolish the Federal Reserve System. So let's see how far we can get with them. As time limits us this evening, I'm going to splash around on the first 3. And if you're interested in the others, you'll just have to dig them out of the book. How's that for a plug for the book? Huh? But the first three, interesting enough as they are. To do that, I'd like to go back in time again, but this time not quite so far back. We're going to go back to 1910, and I'd like to tell you why the creature from Jekyll Island bears that title. Jekyll Island is a real island off the coast of Georgia, as most of you folks probably know. Back in California, we don't know anything about Jekyll Island. So I'm not talking about some slimy thing that comes out of the lagoon dripping seaweed from its fingers or anything like that, although sometimes in my mind I think of the Federal Reserve that way. I'm talking about a real island which today you can visit. As a matter of fact, a couple of weeks ago I did visit Jekyll Island. Since I'm supposed to be an expert on this topic, I thought I ought to at least see what the island looked like, and it does indeed look exactly like I thought it would. But back in 1910, Jekyll Island was wholly owned by a small group of millionaires from New York, people like J.P. Morgan and William Rockefeller, and this is where their families went to spend the winter months. And the group that owned it was called the Jekyll Island Club, and it was a very exclusive resort. And it was at this resort on Jekyll Island in 1910 that a highly secret meeting took place among the top financiers of the world, literally. And the first draft of the Federal Reserve Act was hammered together. So the creature was literally conceived, if not born. It was conceived on Jekyll Island. And that's the reason for the title of my book. But the story is more interesting than that. Those are just the bare bones. I'd like to tell you about that meeting and how it came about, and tell you a little bit about the secrecy. Because the secrecy that surrounded that meeting is a clue. It's a very important clue as to the nature of the Federal Reserve System, and it's a clue as to why we should really recognize it as an appearance of the fourth kind. Here's how it happened. It was November of 1910, late in the evening, when 7 men gathered at the New Jersey Railroad terminal to board the private railroad car that belonged to Senator Nelson Aldrich. Aldrich was the Republican whip in the Senate at that time. And he's a very powerful man and a very wealthy man. I'll tell you a little bit more about him in a moment, but nevertheless, it was his private railroad car that was in readiness at the New Jersey Railroad station. And he and 6 other men came together. They had been instructed to approach the railroad station separately, not to be seen together under any circumstances, not to talk to each other, not to dine together, not to talk to reporters. They were well-known men, and had any reporters seen them, they surely would have recognized them, and they were not to have any discussions with reporters of any kind. One of the men, by the way, came somewhat in disguise. He carried a shotgun in a case. Just in case somebody would ask him where he was going, he could say he was going on a duck hunting trip. And we find out that later we find out from his son, who wrote about it, and said that his father never shot a gun in his life. It was just part of the disguise. When they got there and they were aboard the car, they were instructed to use first names only, not to even use their full names in addressing each other in the privacy of the car. They were to use first names only, and some of them even abandoned their first names and used code names. The reason for that is because there were servants aboard the car, and they didn't want these servants to recognize who these people were, for fear that they would tell their friends and somehow the word would get out. And it was absolutely imperative that the fact that these men were meeting together must remain secret. There are few wars of history that were planned in greater secrecy than this meeting. Well, the train took off from New Jersey late in the evening. It traveled all night, all the next day, all the next night. And the following morning, when the men awoke, they were at a terminal there at Brunswick, Georgia, which was right across the inland straits from Jekyll Island. So they embarked on a ferry, went across to the island, and for 9 days stayed at the clubhouse on Jekyll Island. The season there normally began in January, so you see in November the island was vacant. Just a few maintenance people there. The servants that were brought in from the mainland were hand-chosen to make sure that they would not recognize any of these people. For 9 days, they hammered out the Federal Reserve System, and then another day and a half back to New York, where they disappeared. And for years following that, they denied. They and their friends and the intellectuals who were writing about these things all denied that such a meeting ever took place. It's just rumor, they said. Not at all. Then, as the facts began to come out, some of them admitted, well, yeah, we got together and we talked about banking, did some hunting, did some drinking, this sort of thing. And it was only until later, after the Federal Reserve System was firmly established and revered as a cherished institution, so to speak, that the participants at this meeting began to boldly talk about their part in it. And eventually they wrote books, they gave interviews to newspaper reporters, and they wrote magazine articles, and their families wrote about it and so forth, and they began to tell the story in great detail. In fact, they even began to compete with each other for the honor of who was the most important person there and who made the greatest contribution to it. Now, that is what happened at the meeting, and I'd like to tell you now who was there. I mentioned Senator Aldrich. He was chairman of the National Monetary Commission. That was the group that Congress put together for the purpose of investigating the banking systems of the world to see if they could offer proposed legislation for reforming America's banking system. There was a great deal of concern at that time over abuse of our banking system because the concentration of power had gone into the hands of just a few very large financial institutions in New York on Wall Street. This is what they called the money trust. And so the public at large and many of the congressmen were concerned about that. Some of the banks had failed. The money supply was expanding and contracting, expanding and contracting. They had some booms and some busts. They had a crash of 1907. And so there was need, they felt, for banking reform. And it was the responsibility of the National Monetary Commission, headed by Senator Aldrich, to investigate other banking systems and to make a proposal to Congress for banking reform. Senator Aldrich was an associate of J.P. Morgan. He was the father-in-law of John D. Rockefeller, Jr., which means, of course, that eventually he would become the grandfather of Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller, who was the Vice President of the United States. Also aboard that car and at that meeting was Abraham Piatt Andrew, who was at that time Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. Frank Vanderlip was there. He was president of the National City Bank of New York. Now, that was the largest and the most powerful of all the banks in New York at that time, and he represented the financial interests of William Rockefeller and the international investment firm of Kuhn, Loeb and Company. Henry Davison was there. He was the senior partner of the J.P. Morgan Company. Charles Norton was there, president of the First National Bank of New York, another very powerful city center bank. Benjamin Strong was there, head of J.P. Morgan's Bankers Trust Company, and incidentally, Strong would eventually become the first head of the Federal Reserve System after it was formed. And last, but certainly not least, there was Paul Warburg. Warburg was born in Germany. He later became a naturalized American citizen. But he was a partner in Kuhn, Loeb and Company. He was a representative of the Rothschild banking interests in England and France. And he was the brother of Max Warburg, who was the head of the Warburg Banking Consortium in Germany and the Netherlands. Very, very powerful individual, and his contacts in Europe. And incidentally, as an interesting footnote to all this, for those of you who are Little Orphan Annie fans, you remember the cartoon strip? There was a character in there by the name of Daddy Warbucks. Well, Paul Warburg was the real Daddy Warbucks, and everybody knew at the time that Daddy Warbucks was the characterization of this very real person. Altogether, these 7 men represented approximately 1/4 of the total wealth of the entire world. Now, did this meeting actually happen in the kind of secrecy that I said, and did they really draft the Federal Reserve System there? As I mentioned, later on, the participants began to reveal the facts. I'd like to quote to you just one example of this historical record, so you can see I'm not just making this thing up. Frank Vanderlip, who was one of the participants, wrote an article that appeared in the Saturday Evening Post on February 9, 1935. And I'd like to read for you just an excerpt from that article. Vanderlip said, "I do not feel it is any exaggeration to speak of our secret expedition to Jekyll Island as the occasion of the actual conception of what eventually became the Federal Reserve System. We were told to leave our last names behind us. We were told further that we should avoid dining together on the night of our departure. We were instructed to come one at a time and as unobtrusively as possible to the railroad terminal on the New Jersey littoral of the Hudson, where Senator Aldrich's private car would be in readiness, attached to the rear end of a train to the south. Once aboard the private car, we began to observe the taboo that had been fixed on last names. We addressed one another as Ben, Paul, Nelson, and Abe. Davison and I adopted even deeper disguises, abandoning our first names. On the theory that we were always right, he became Wilbur and I became Orville after those 2 aviation pioneers, the Wright brothers. The servants and train crew may have known the identities of 1 or 2 of us, but they did not know all. And it was the names of all printed together that would have made our mysterious journey significant in Washington, in Wall Street, even in London. Discovery, we knew, simply must not happen." Well, why the secrecy? So what's the big deal about this? A bunch of bankers, even well-known bankers, even very wealthy bankers. What's wrong with them getting together in private and talking about banking? Well, Vanderlip himself answers that very question in the same article. He says, "If it were to be exposed publicly that our particular group had got together and written a banking bill, that bill would have no chance whatever of passage by Congress." Why not? Remember, the purpose of the banking bill was to break the grip of the money trust, and it was being written by the money trust. Had the public known this, the scheme, or as I say, the scam, would have been exposed right from the very get-go. It would not have worked. And that is why Vanderlip said, "Discovery, we knew, simply must not happen." Well, there's something else about that group that's really interesting. Not only was it obviously strange that the bankers would be writing their own reform bill, but if you look at the composition of that group, something should look very, very peculiar. Here we had the Rockefellers, we had the Morgan interests, we had Kuhn Loeb and Company, we had the Warburgs and the Rothschilds. Ladies and gentlemen, these were the giants of the financial industry at that time, and they had been competitors. They were competitors. Prior to this time, they were head-to-head, vying for the financial markets. Now, it's true that a few years prior to this time, for the 10 years prior to this time, more and more these competitors were foregoing competition and entering into joint ventures. It was old John D. Rockefeller I who said, "Competition is a sin." And that is true with all monopoly capitalists, and I'd like to point out here there's a big difference between monopoly capitalists and free enterprise capitalists. Free enterprise capitalists are people like myself. I believe in capitalism and in the free market where people are free to choose and free to compete. But just because a person has a lot of money doesn't mean that they're a free enterprise capitalist. They have a lot of capital, perhaps. But it's so traditional among these people to seek to avoid competition. They reject the free enterprise system, and they seek to form monopoly. And at this time, they become what I would call a monopoly capitalist. These people were monopoly capitalists, and they dreaded competition. They realized finally that they could beat out all the little banks and all the little investment houses, but they were at loggerheads with each other, and they were just bloodying each other, and they couldn't destroy one another. So they finally said, okay, let's get together and quit this nonsensical competition. They came together, and they formed a cartel. Ladies and gentlemen, when you look at the structure of the Federal Reserve System, you realize finally that you are looking at a banking cartel. Now, a cartel is defined as a grouping of independent business operations that come together for the purpose of reducing or eliminating competition between themselves. They do that by fixing prices or dividing up markets or dividing between them what services and products they will produce and so forth. And by so doing, they enhance their profit margins. And the obverse of that coin is that the public then pays more for those products and services. And this is just as true in the field of banking as it is in any other field. These competitors came together on Jekyll Island and hammered out a cartel agreement. And it's impossible to understand what the Federal Reserve System is and what it is doing without that clear understanding that it is a cartel. And there's still something else about it. You peel off the scam of the fact that these bankers were writing their own reform, which was obviously not a good idea, and then you realize that it's a cartel, and you peel that off and you look deeper still, and you find one more element that is necessary to understand. And that is that the cartel went into partnership with the federal government of the United States, which cartels often do, by the way, because one of the things about cartels is that they tend to fly apart. Yes, they come together, they agree to reduce or eliminate competition, and that works for a while until one of the members of the cartel decides that it's now stronger than all the rest, and it breaks away and decides it's going to break one of the other members and get a larger share, and they violate the cartel agreement. They revert back to competition for a while, and then there's a lot of blood on the battlefield, and they come back and they regroup again in a new cartel arrangement, but this time the relationship and the balance of forces is a little bit different. The history of cartels is the history of flying apart and coming back together again. Or sometimes they're challenged by an unforeseen competitor who arises on the horizon and forces the cartel to split until they bring in the new competitor into the cartel, and then they go back together. And so one of the things you will notice about cartels is that they always, at least in modern times, they always try to bring government into it. They need government to enforce their cartel agreement. They need a law on the books to force everybody in the industry to act in accordance with what they agreed to do when they formed their cartel. Now, the way they get that enacted into law and to get the public to accept it is they don't say, this is a cartel agreement. They say, no, we are doing this to protect the public in some way. It's always sold as a means of protecting the public, whether it's regulating the airlines, you know, so that people will have fair airline fares, you know. I remember a few years ago when the milk cartel got a law passed to fix milk prices. Remember that? This was sold to the American people as a means of making sure that nobody was gouged on the price of milk. Now milk is an essential thing. Babies need milk. Children need milk. So we wanted to make sure that nobody paid more than they had to for milk. So the dairies got together and in sort of a cartel agreement, they passed a law to fix the price of milk. Well, I happen to know in some areas that where there was competition between the dairies, the price of milk was approximately 18% less than what it was after they protected the public and fixed the prices, you see. Well, I don't need to tell this group that. This is the reality of modern politics. I'm not being cynical when I say that. I'm just being realistic, that cartels and monopolies always strive to have the government enforce their cartel or monopoly agreements, and they do so in the name of protecting the public. So here we had the banking cartel doing exactly that. They went into partnership with the federal government of the United States. Now, it's easy to see why the bankers would want a cartel. That is to enhance their profit margins and to protect themselves. I'll talk more about that in a moment as to how they did that and some of the details of how this worked. But you might wonder, why would government want to go along with it? Well, it was to the mutual benefit of both, I can assure you. And to explain how government benefited or continues to benefit from this partnership, let me tell you how money is created. This is going to be amazing for those of you who have not been over this ground before. You're going to wonder if you've wandered into the twilight zone. I want to tell you in advance that you should not try to figure this out. Do not think that this has to make sense. And if you start scratching your head and you're saying, I don't get it, it's because you're not supposed to get it. It doesn't make sense. But it seems very complicated, and most people are willing to throw up their hands and say, I don't understand this. I guess I better let the experts take care of this. You know, I'm not going to go to Harvard Law School or Harvard Economics Department or anything. I'll leave that up to the bankers and to the economists. That's what you're supposed to do. Let me just tell you up front, this is a scam. And once you understand that it's a scam, then it's very, very simple. Okay, here's how it works. Congress needs money. Congress always needs money. They need lots of it. And they never have enough from taxes. There's a funny thing about taxes. People will pay only so much, and then they dig in their heels. That's been true throughout all history. Many a monarchy has been overthrown for no other reason than the taxes were too high. And that's just as true today. If your representatives right here in Washington were to raise your taxes up beyond a certain unbearable point, the people of the United States would throw them out of office and elect somebody else. So Congress says, well, we need more money. We don't have enough tax revenue. Where are we going to get it? Well, the only other place is to borrow it. So what they do is they run over to the printing office and they print up some nice certificates. They're about this big, and they put very fancy borders on them. And there's an eagle up there, and they have a nice impressive seal at the bottom. And it printed across the top, it says United States Treasury. They might say certificate or note or bond or something like that. And then somebody signs it, and there's all kinds of printing on it, and it looks very impressive. And you hold it up to light, and it really says IOU. That's what it says. But it's not complete yet. It's just a blank IOU. Now they have to have somebody give them money in exchange for the IOU. So then they go into the market, and they offer these for sale. They hope the public will come forward and give them some of the money that has previously been created, give it back to the government in return for the IOU to pay it at a future date plus interest. And the public does do this. Not only the public, but other banks and institutions and other governments, central banks around the world. A lot of people are willing to exchange their money for these IOUs. But never enough, or often not enough, because the government needs more money than that. So, not to worry, when the public stops buying, they just go on down the street to the Federal Reserve System. And they say, well, these are the leftover bonds that nobody wants at those interest rates, which they determined, of course, what the interest rates would be. So the Federal Reserve says, okay, that's why I'm here. It pulls open the bottom drawer, pulls out this checkbook, flips it open and writes a big check to the United States Treasury, $1 billion or whatever the amount is, and an officer of the bank signs it, another piece of paper, not as impressive as the first one, but it's good enough, and they give that to the Treasury. Now the question is, let's look at this checkbook that they just pulled out. What account is behind that checkbook? What money do they draw from for that? And the answer is none. There is none. There's no money. There's no account even. It's just a checkbook. Now, if you and I were to do that, we'd go to jail like that. But they can do it because Congress wants them to do it. That's the deal, you see. Congress needs the money. This is the scam, or just the beginning of it. You think it's bad now? Wait, we've just started. So Congress wants the Federal Reserve to have that ability to create money out of nothing, literally, so that they can have it when all other resources fail. So that's the beginning of the chain. Now Congress has got the check for $1 billion, and it deposits it into its banking account. Ching, all the numbers show up in the ledger, and they now have $1 billion that they didn't have before. And so they're able to start writing checks themselves. And so they write a check for $20 million to some foreign dictator, and they pay off some voters with welfare programs, and they maybe have a military exercise that threaten to take over a little country, or whatever they spend their money on, you know. They spend the money real fast, and some of it even goes to the, you know, useful things, like they build some roads and they pay the post office workers with it, so forth. Now that money came out of the desk drawer of the Federal Reserve System, that $1 billion that went out there, newly created money. Let's just follow a little bit of that money that went to the post office worker. Let's say, to simplify this, that he got $100, and now he has a paycheck for $100. And he's happy with that. He doesn't realize that that money didn't exist prior to this event. He thought that it came out of the Treasury somewhere, that somebody had it. He doesn't care. He takes it home, gives it to his wife, who deposits it into their checking account so they can write checks on it and buy groceries and so forth. And now when she deposits that check into their checking account, the bank gets $100 that it didn't have before, the local commercial bank. And it says, oh boy, we got $100, and they open up the loan window. And they say, come on everybody, we have money now to loan. Now, hang on for this. Are they offering to loan $100? No. They offer to loan $900. Why? Because part of this deal is, with the Federal Reserve, tells the banks that they only have to have 10% in reserve for every dollar that they loan out. Only 10% in reserve. Well, the $100 they have, they label that as reserve. So they put that in the ledger that says reserves, or in this case excess reserves, but it doesn't make a difference what they call it. And now they say we have $900 to loan, and people line up and they say, we'll borrow it. I want to make a payment on my car or whatever. And so they whip out their checkbook and they start writing checks or crediting your accounts. And the question is now, where does that money come from? What account does the bank have to draw that money from? And the answer is the same. There isn't any. The bank just creates that money right out of nothing when they write those checks or credit your account. Can you believe this? So for every dollar that the Federal Reserve creates out of thin air to give to the government, the commercial banks create 9 more out of thin air to loan to people like you and me, and it goes out into commerce. So for every dollar, therefore, that's created for the federal government, there's a total of 10 altogether that go out into the economy. Now these dollars, in this case we were talking about $1 billion creation, that means $10 billion had been created by the banking fraternity out of thin air because of the Federal Reserve mechanism. This is what I call the Mandrake mechanism, by the way. For those of you who remember back in the 40s, there was a cartoon character by the name of Mandrake the Magician, and he could create things out of nothing and make them poof, disappear. So I call it the Mandrake mechanism. Now this money that goes out there, this $10 billion and much more than that, dilutes the value of all the dollars that had been out there prior to that. So with this ever-increasing flood of money going out there, what happens? Well, prices start going up. It's what we call inflation. It's an appearance of the fourth kind, actually, because prices don't really go up. What happens is that the value of the dollar goes down, and so the relative position spreads apart. Prices really remain fairly stable throughout all of this. For example, if the money had been backed on something, backed by something of tangible value like gold or silver, you would see how stable prices really were over long periods of time. For example, in ancient Rome, a 1 ounce coin, 1 ounce of gold, would buy a fine toga, a handcrafted belt, and a nice pair of sandals. Today, in general, the market fluctuates, but if you look at it over a 6-month, 7-month period of time, 1 ounce of gold, you can walk into any men's store and get a nice suit, a handcrafted belt, and a nice pair of shoes. The price hasn't changed since the time of Rome. But the value of the monetary unit that we use, these paper things, which people call dollars, and they really aren't, they're Federal Reserve notes, the value of those Federal Reserve notes keeps going down, 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 because the quantity keeps getting larger, larger, and larger. And this is a tax, ladies and gentlemen. It's a tax that you and I pay through the appearance of rising prices. It means the diminishing of our purchasing power. And that purchasing power, all of that money, even though we don't realize it, is being taken from us, has been taken from us, and given to the federal government through the Federal Reserve System. It is a tax just as real as the one we pay through income tax and excise tax. It is the most cruel tax of all because it hits the poor people the most and the ones who are retired and have fixed incomes. But it is a tax. It's a hidden tax. And that's why Congress likes it so much, because people don't even know they're paying it, and therefore they don't get mad at Congress. It's a scam. Let's go back to Jekyll Island. They had a problem back there in what to call this cartel or this partnership. They were borrowing this partnership concept from Europe. This scheme that I had been describing for a few minutes here actually started to originate as early as the 16th century in Europe. By the time the Bank of England was formed in 1694, the concept had been perfected. And from that point forward, all of the governments of Europe went to this kind of a partnership between government and bankers, because they were able to create money for the government without the people knowing it. And of course, on the bankers' side, they were able to collect interest on this money, which they created out of nothing, which isn't too bad. Now, if you could open up your checkbook and you didn't have any account behind it, nobody knew that, just a checkbook, you printed it yourself, and you can write a check for $10,000 and then loan it to your neighbor, and he pays you 8% interest. That's pretty nice. And this is where the bankers why the bankers like the system so much, because they can collect interest literally on nothing. Now, it's true that they do perform a service in the exchange of money units and clearing checks and storing valuables and that kind of thing, and they charge service fees for that, and that's perfectly legitimate. If banks were restricted to their proper function, they would charge fees for all of their services. But right now, the big action is in this interest on nothing. Well, this concept had been developed in Europe, as I said, and these little partnerships that had sprung up all over Europe were called central banks. That's what they called them. Don't ask me to say why, because I don't know. That was the name for them. When it came time to create the Federal Reserve System, Aldrich had been over to Europe, and he had studied all the central banks of Europe. Max Warburg, of course, who was the brother of what's our friend? What's our friend here? Paul Warburg. Yes, I'm thinking of Max. Max is the brother in Germany. Paul Warburg is sitting there on Jekyll Island. They were students of the central bank mechanism, and this group decided, hey, we want a central bank here. But now the problem was that the people of the United States did not want a central bank. And the sentiment was very strong that in America, if we were going to have some kind of a banking reform, we didn't want to imitate the old world. We wanted a system that would be unique to reflect the unique political and economic conditions of America. And so one of the problems that they had on Jekyll Island is what to call their central bank, other than a central bank. So they devised 3 words. They said, let's call it federal in order to create the image that the government has something to do with it. Let's add the word reserve to create the impression that we've got reserves someplace, you know, like it was a sound banking concept. Let's add the word system, because as I said earlier, that one of the concerns was the concentration of power into the hands of a few banks on Wall Street in New York. So they were talking about setting up a system of regional banks around the country, 12 to be exact, where you could see these buildings in San Francisco and in Boston and elsewhere, and that was evidence that the power was being diffused throughout a system rather than concentrated and centralized. And so we'll add the word system to reinforce that concept. And so, of course, in the end, what did we get? We got something that was not federal. There have never been any reserves. It's not a system in the sense that that power is diffused. And as far as those regional banks are concerned, they're not even banks. So all of these words were actually appearances of the 4th kind. And they still remain that way today because there isn't really one person in 1,000 in our country today that has any inkling about the reality of the Federal Reserve System. This has not been an issue for debate or discussion. And Epictetus is responsible for that because he and his descendants have convinced the American people that this is just too complicated. Just leave it up to the experts. Somehow it's all being taken care of. And it has been taken care of. The next step was to sell this concept to the public and to Congress. Paul Warburg warned Aldrich at the time. He said, Aldrich, when you introduce this bill, or when you have this bill introduced into Congress, don't put your name on it, because you are so clearly identified with big business interests that it'll be a giveaway and nobody will vote for it. They can see what it is. You will have destroyed the whole purpose of our secrecy. But apparently Aldrich's ego was too big to listen, and he insisted, no, he's going to put his name on the bill. After all, he was the head of the Monetary Commission, and he wanted to go down in history as the creator of this wonderful institution. So when it came out of the egg, when it hatched, it was called the Aldrich Bill. And you know what happened? Thumbs down. Just as Warburg predicted, everybody rejected it because he was so clearly associated with big business. Well, that was a setback, but it certainly wasn't the defeat. It didn't end it there, because what they did is they took the same bill and they scrambled it up a little bit. They moved paragraph 7 to paragraph 2. They rewrote some of the words. They added a few provisions that hadn't been there, but in essence, it was the same bill, but they found some new sponsors for it. Now, Aldrich was the big business Republican. It was clear that what they needed were a couple of Democrats to support the bill, because everyone knew, we know, don't we, that the Republicans represent big business and the Democrats represent the common man. This is, I mean, like Ted Kennedy, you know. It doesn't make a difference how much money you have, you still represent the common man. So they found a couple of very common millionaires by the name of Carter Glass and Robert Owen, who were Democrats. And they sponsored this bill, this revised bill. And with these provisions, some of these new provisions which were added to make the bill sound more sensible and more cautious, they obtained the support of William Jennings Bryan, who was the great populist and defender of the common man. And so it came out now with a whole new image, you see. It was the same bill, but it had new sponsors and a new image. Now, Aldrich and Vanderlip, remember, these were two of the guys that were at that meeting at Jekyll Island, and very, very influential bankers, went on the lecture circuit giving speeches condemning this new bill. They gave interviews to newspaper reporters. Oh, this would be a terrible thing. It'll ruin banking. It'll ruin the country. And, of course, the public looked at that and said, aha, the big bankers don't like it. Must be pretty good. It reminded me of Brer Rabbit saying, oh, no, Brer Bear, don't throw me in the briar patch, you know. These fellows knew exactly what they were doing. They were pretending to oppose it. Meanwhile, the same individuals were spending tremendous amounts of money, and by tremendous I mean millions of dollars, which were a lot more in those days than it is today, to set up committees to study the Federal Reserve Act and to promote it to the public. They set up, they gave large amounts of money to some of the larger universities to create departments of economics, and they appointed professors to these chairs to head up the departments, and the professors then went out like so many pounds of hamburger they were bought, you know, they went out and gave speeches about how wonderful this bill would be. The same men who were publicly condemning the act were financing the promotional campaign to sell it to the public and to the Congress. Warburg stepped in, and again he proved himself to be the master strategist. It was his idea that some of the excellent provisions be put in it that were put in to sell people like William Jennings Bryan on the soundness of the bill. And some of his banking associates said, Warburg, what are you doing? We don't want these provisions in there. And he said, be quiet. I'm making this up, of course. I don't know what they said, but I can just hear it. He's probably saying, be quiet, be quiet. Don't worry. This is just to get the bill passed. Get it passed. We can change it later. Now, he did write that, by the way, in some of his monographs. He did say in very distinguished language, the object is to get the Federal Reserve Bill passed. It may not have everything in it that we want, but we can perfect it later, is how he phrased it, actually. And it worked. The Federal Reserve Act has been amended over 100 times since it was passed. And ladies and gentlemen, every one of those good provisions that were put in to get it passed have long been removed. Warburg knew exactly what he was doing. And so with this kind of brilliant strategy and deception going on, it's not surprising that the bill became popular. And on December 22nd, 1913, as Congress was recessing for Christmas, the bill was passed and it was signed the next day by President Wilson, and the United States finally had the Federal Reserve System. Well, what did we get? In summary, we got a corporation. It was chartered by Congress, and it was given the exclusive right to manufacture the nation's money supply. We got a mechanism whereby Congress has been able to raise unlimited taxes without any concern whatsoever, anytime it wishes. Unlimited taxes through the process of inflation without the public even knowing that Congress is taxing them. We got a mechanism whereby the banks can earn interest on nothing. And finally, we got a mechanism for protecting the member banks from failure, from going bankrupt, and to do so at taxpayers' expense, to get the taxpayers to bail them out when their loans go sour. I'd like to turn to the question of who owns the Federal Reserve System. You hear a lot of talk about that. We start that by explaining that the Federal Reserve System is not an agency of the federal government. As I said, it's a corporation chartered by Congress. And like all corporations, it has stock. And the stock is owned, in this case, by the member banks in the system. Now, those banks that put up the most money, the larger banks with the larger assets, put up more money, more capital into the system, and they own more stock than the smaller banks. But that is where the mirage of private ownership ends. Sometimes you hear people say, well, the Federal Reserve System is privately owned. Well, that's a half-truth. That's where the private ownership concept ends, because the stock does not carry with it all of the rights of ownership that other stock would. For example, the owners of this stock cannot sell it. Well, if you cannot sell something, you don't really own it. Say. The stock is not really a certificate of ownership so much as it is a receipt for the capital they put into the system. That's really what it is. Furthermore, regardless of how much money the member banks put in, they all have just one vote. So you see, there's a serious deviation. Not only that, they cannot vote for their management. They can vote for the board of directors of the regional banks, but they have no say-so at the national board, which is appointed by the President of the United States. So as you can see, this is not private ownership at all. So what is it? It's not government. It's not a private corporation. It's a hybrid. It's a unique hybrid. It's part government, it's part private, and it's a unique formation which was formed to serve its unique function of a partnership between government and private banking. So it's not surprising that it should be a hybrid, because it in fact does serve a hybrid function. I think there's too much emphasis placed today on this issue of who owns the Fed, because I know there are some movements afoot out there in the past that have said, you see, this is all owned by private bankers. The solution, therefore, they say, is to take it away from the private bankers and turn it over to the Treasury. In other words, split the partnership apart between bankers and politicians and turn it all over to the politicians. That's basically what they're promoting here. This wouldn't change a thing. The same people would run it. They would follow the same agenda. In Europe, all of these central bank mechanisms that have been operating all these years are, in fact, direct arms of their respective governments, and they do exactly the same thing that the Federal Reserve System is doing here. It's not so much who owns them. It's not the technicality of stock ownership or anything like that that's the problem. It's what they do. It's the fact that they create fiat money. They create money out of nothing. That's the problem. So I say that the agenda would be the same even if we were to turn it over to the Treasury. Well, what is that agenda? Here we have another appearance of the fourth kind. Everyone has been told, I was certainly taught in school, that the purpose of the Federal Reserve System was to stabilize the economy and to put an end to chaotic banking that occurred prior to the Federal Reserve System. Everybody knows that. Nobody questions it at all. It's an act of faith. Just to give you an idea, there's a textbook that right now is used in most schools, or I should say in many schools. I don't know about most. But many of them use a textbook on economics written by Paul Samuelson, and this is what the kids learn. The Federal Reserve sprang from the panic of 1907 with its alarming epidemic of bank failures. The country was fed up once and for all with the anarchy of unstable private banking. Okay? If that is the purpose of the Federal Reserve System, those are its goals, then I'm here to tell you it has failed to meet its objectives. Let's take a look at its report card, since it was created in 1913. It has presided over the crashes of 1921 and 1929, the Great Depression of 29 through 39, recessions in the years 53, 57, 69, 75, and 81, a stock market Black Monday in 87. We know that corporate debt is soaring. Personal debt is greater than ever. Both business and personal bankruptcies are at an all-time high. Banks and savings and loan associations have failed in larger numbers than ever before. Interest on the national debt is consuming over half of our taxes right now. Heavy industry has all been destroyed and been taken over by overseas competitors. We're facing an international trade deficit for the first time in our history. 75% of downtown Los Angeles and most other metropolitan areas are now owned by foreigners, and over half of our nation is in a state of economic recession. Now, that's the report card of the Federal Reserve System after 80 years of stabilizing our economy. And so I don't think it's very controversial to say that the Federal Reserve System has failed to reach its stated objectives. The only controversial part is why not? I say the reason is that those have never been its true objectives. That's why it doesn't make sense. That's why we think it has failed. Those are not its objectives. What are its objectives? What are the objectives of any cartel? To enhance the profit position of the members of the cartel. It's very simple. Now, I'm sure that these men would like to see the economy of the United States prosper. I'm sure they're not out to hammer down the nation just to destroy it, because they don't want to kill the goose that lays the golden egg. But I'm also certain that whenever there is a conflict between the interests of the nation and their private interests within the cartel, as there is almost daily, you can be sure that they will decide and act in the direction that will serve their personal agenda. That's just human nature. What were and what are the true objectives of the Federal Reserve System? Well, I can tell you what they were in 1910 when these men met on Jekyll Island and talked about it, because they were also talking about it in the financial journals at the time. And they had 4 objectives. The first thing that concerned them was that their control over the monetary system was being eroded as the nation moved to the west and to the south, and as small banks kept springing up along the frontier. Every year a little bit more of the financial power of the nation moved away from New York. And this was a matter of great concern to those bankers. Yes, they still had the lion's share by far, but they were able to project the graph and see where it was headed, and they decided now was the time to put a stop to this. The second thing was equally of concern to them, and that was they were worried about private capital formation. Now, that merely means that businesses at that time were paying for their expansion and research and development projects out of their own savings rather than going to the bank and borrowing money. Now, this is something that no banker can stand for, you understand. You have to go and borrow money, otherwise the banks are not very happy. And so what was happening is the corporations were being frugal. Interest rates were just high enough. They had reached a natural balance point where it was attractive for industry to save their money rather than pay that high interest rate to borrow money. So the bankers said what we need is a flexible currency. That's what they called it. That merely means they wanted the ability to create money out of nothing so that they could create enough of it that they could lower the interest rates and lure the businessmen back into the banks for the loans. Now, if you make money out of nothing, you don't have to charge an awful lot of interest on it to make a profit. So that was the deal. They wanted to be able to make money out of nothing so they could lower the interest rates, still make a good profit, and lure business investment and expansion capital or needs for capital back into the banks. The third objective was to protect the banks from bank runs. Now, bank run happens when people decide they want their money back that they've deposited into the bank, into something that the banks call demand deposits. See, there are 2 kinds of deposits generally, demand and time deposits. A time deposit would be something like in your savings and loan association, where you are told when you put your money in that you may not get it out anytime you want it. Or if you buy a CD, that's a better example. You buy a CD for a period of time, 90 days or a year or whatever it is. You know right up front that you're letting loose of your money for a stated period of time. That is a time deposit. A demand deposit is where you go to the bank and you put your money in, and the bank smiles at you and says, yes, you can have it back anytime you want it. Just demand it, and it's yours. What they don't tell you is that the minute you walk out the door, they're loaning it to somebody else, you see. So if you change your mind, you walk back and say, I changed my mind, I want my money back. They said, well, we don't have it. We just loaned it. But don't worry, we have somebody else that's over here, and we'll give you theirs. But what happens if that person walks in and says, well, I want mine? Well, you can play that game for a little while, but after about 2 or 3% of the depositors all get the idea that they want their money back on demand, the bank is embarrassed because it runs out of that meager reserve it has in the vault. it just doesn't have any more. It's gone. It's all out. And so they have to close their doors and declare bankruptcy. They go out of business. And banks don't like that. So one of their concerns was to how to make all the banks work together so that if there's a run on one or two of them, the others could be forced to surrender part of their meager reserves to come to the aid of the ones that are having a bank run. Now, in a free system, the banks undoubtedly wouldn't be willing to do that because they'd say, wait a minute, what happens if they started running my bank? I'm not giving you any of my money. So they needed a way to force all the banks into a pool where by law, where the government could enforce the cartel agreement, by law, they could protect themselves from bank runs. And finally, their ultimate objective was when the ultimate losses come, how to pass those losses on to the taxpayer, how to cause the taxpayer to bail out their bad loans. That was the fourth objective of the cartel. And I'm saying that that was and is the real objective of the Federal Reserve System. Let's take a look at the report card now with that objective in mind. Did they keep control of the financial power of the nation in the hands of a few powerful banks in New York? Of course they did. There was a book written a few years ago, a very popular book, bestseller, by William Grider. It was called Secrets of the Temple. Grider is an interesting person. First of all, his book had a lot of excellent history in it. The thing that makes it interesting is that he came to some real wacko conclusions. And I'll tell you what those were in a minute. But his history, I think, was pretty good. He's generally considered to be a liberal, so and a defender of the Federal Reserve System. So you need not worry that I'm reading a biased report here. This is what Grider said. He said, at the time, the conventional wisdom in Congress was that the government institution would finally harness the money trust, disarm its powers, and establish broad democratic control over money and credit. The results were nearly the opposite. The money reforms enacted in 1913, in fact, helped to preserve the status quo, to stabilize the old order. Money center bankers would not only gain dominance over the new central bank, but would also enjoy new installation against instability and their own decline. Once the Fed was in operation, the steady diffusion of financial power halted. Wall Street maintained its dominant position and even enhanced it. End quote. That's true. You just look at the reality of the financial market today. But the interesting thing about Grider and his wacky conclusions is that having proven in his own book that the Federal Reserve System has served against the public interest and in fact was designed to do that from the very beginning, what is his solution? To abolish the Fed? Oh, no, nothing like that, you understand? Well, how about a substantial reform? No, it's okay. The system is okay. What's his solution? Well, he says, you see, it's so complicated. What we really need is just wiser men in control. That's his solution. You see, this is the kind of powder puff criticism it takes to be accepted in the mainstream media, to be published by Simon & Schuster. You wouldn't dare come out and call for a radical reform or abolishing the Fed. They would never publish it because if they did, their bank loan would be called in. Or something like that. Was self-capitalization replaced by bank credit? Wow, that's one of the problems with our economy today. Companies are going belly up right and left because they can no longer service the debt. It's a fact of life that many companies today give more money to the banks in interest on their loans than they pay to the people who own those companies. The bankers make more out of industry than the owners. Yes, they did succeed in that objective. That came about because of flexible currency, flexible monetary system. Finally, and perhaps the most important question, have they been able to pass on their losses to the taxpayer? Well, this is Operation Bailout. You may have noticed every time a large corporation or a bank is in trouble financially, they run to Congress and get Congress to bail them out with tax dollars. Let's take a big corporation that is in debt to a consortium of banks for $100 million or whatever it is. Their profits are getting lower and lower, all this interest going to the banks, they can't sustain it, and finally they say, we give up. We can no longer service our debt. We cannot pay you, Mr. Banker. We're going out of business. Well, they don't really do that, of course. What they do is they talk about it. They, you know, this would be terrible if we'd stopped this operation. We're having fun doing this. So they go to Congress. Management from the corporation and the management from the bank go to Congress and they say something like this. You know, if this corporation, this wonderful American institution were allowed to fail, there would be so many people put out of work. They would lose their jobs. There would be ever-widening waves of unemployment. People would be hungry. They'd be desperate. They say, look what they produce. Look at this valuable and essential product or service that they produce. If that went out of existence, it would probably weaken our national defense posture and invite an attack from a foreign power or some such. I mean, the arguments they come up with are absolutely brilliant. And they go on and on and on of how terrible it would be and how Congress must protect the little man. They never say protect the bank, you understand. No, must protect the people. And the congressman says, yes, we certainly don't want any kind of a national catastrophe to happen. We don't want people to suffer. So therefore, they vote the necessary funds to cover the loans, to guarantee the loans, or in some cases to actually make the payments so the corporations can continue to pay the interest to the banks. And it's a lot more complex than that. I have a whole chapter written on it, but this is the basic game called bailout. And in case you haven't noticed, the more interesting games that have been played over the last few years, we had Penn Central Railroad bailed out in 1970. In that same year, they bailed out Lockheed. Commonwealth Bank of Detroit was bailed out in 1972. New York City was bailed out in 1975. It looks like it might have to be bailed out again pretty soon. Chrysler in 1978, First Pennsylvania Bank in 1980, Continental Illinois, a giant bank, was bailed out in 1982, and the list goes on and on and on. Hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, ladies and gentlemen, were created out of nothing by the Federal Reserve System and pumped into the banking fraternity to protect their souring loans, and you paid the bill without even knowing it because that is part of the process that created inflation. I need to say something in passing on this. We haven't seen a lot of inflation yet, primarily because a huge chunk of our bonds and our debt instruments have not passed into our system. They've been purchased by other countries and other investors. The people in Japan and Europe and the Arabs have bought tremendous amounts of government securities. And when they come due and the government has to pay them back, they turn it around and roll it over and put it right back in. When the time comes, when they stop doing that, then the government will not have new money to pay off the old bonds. You see, they're borrowing new money to pay off the old debts. And that rollover goes over and over and over again. It grows bigger every time they roll it around. When people outside of the country stop rolling those debts over or stop rolling over the purchase of the bonds, then who will be able to create the money to pay the bonds off? Now the Federal Reserve System will have to step in, and we'll see the inflation mechanism grow like topsy and turvy. We have hardly seen anything yet because the debt has been pushed outside of our borders. But someday, I don't know when, someday those chickens are going to come flying home. And when they do, there's going to be a lot of chicken feathers around here. So, you and I have paid for this, or will pay for this, through the process, the hidden tax called inflation. And so we come to the conclusion that, yes, the federal government has indeed achieved its objectives in this unholy alliance. Well, let's talk very briefly now about usury. Usury was defined biblically as interest on debt, period. Any interest on debt was usury. In modern times, it's been redefined, and I think properly so, to be any unrealistic or excessive interest on debt. In recognition of the fact that if you work hard for your money and you save it and then you loan it to somebody, you are surrendering the use of your own money for a period of time. You are entitled to be compensated for that sacrifice and for your effort. And so a reasonable payment of interest is certainly not usury. It's simply payment of something for something of value. But what is excessive interest? Thomas Edison said, "People who will not turn a shovelful of dirt on the project, nor contribute a pound of materials, will collect more money than will the people who will supply all the materials and do all the work." Is that true, do you suppose? When I read that, I thought, maybe Tom was exaggerating slightly. So I got my little calculator out and I punched in some numbers. I assumed we were talking about a $100,000 house that has to be built. We allocate $30,000 for land, architect fees, sales commissions, and permits. $70,000 will go to the people who provide all the building materials and all the labor. In other words, for materials and labor, $70,000. The buyer puts down $30,000, takes out an 11% loan over 30 years. We punch in the numbers, and what we find is that the owner of that house will pay $167,806 in interest, which is about 2.5 times greater than paid to those who produce all the labor and all the materials. Now, you may say, well, that includes the time value of money. After all, remember, somebody saved that money and they sacrificed its use. They're entitled to compensation. Not this money. Who saved it? Who sacrificed the use of it? Nobody. This was created on the spot for that loan. $167,000, almost $168,000 interest on nothing, ladies and gentlemen. Now you multiply that, not just for a $100,000 house, but for all the houses in America, all the factories in America, for all the dollars that exist, all the Federal Reserve notes, that exist, all the checkbook money that exists, all the computer money that exists everywhere in the world, American Federal Reserve dollars, Federal Reserve notes. Everywhere in the world, a huge quantity of money. Every dollar of that is earning interest every hour of every day for a bank which created it out of nothing. That is a huge, unimaginable river of wealth flowing into the banking cartel. I say that the Federal Reserve System, which is the instrument behind this, is the supreme instrument of usury. Well, what lies ahead of us, ladies and gentlemen? If you take the present trend, just look over the last 10 or 20 years. You don't have to go back all the way to Phrygia. Just take the last 20 years, and whatever measure you wish to use, inflation, national debt, anything, and you plot it out, and take a ruler and see where it's headed. It's a very nerve-wracking thing to do. You don't have to be a genius to figure out what lies ahead. I foresaw two possible scenarios, and I wrote about them. I called one the pessimistic scenario, and the other one the realistic scenario. Now, you may have noticed I didn't include an optimistic scenario in there, because there isn't any. This is a fact of life. There is no true optimistic scenario in our future. Things are going to be rough no matter what we do. As far as the pessimistic scenario is concerned, I don't want to take a lot of time with that, just to tell you in brief that if we don't stop this trend, we are headed into what is now called the New World Order. A better name for it, I think, would be a high-tech feudalism. Yes, we'll have computers, we'll have television, we'll have rapid transit, we'll have a lot of technology, but as far as our personal freedoms are concerned, we will be living in a feudalistic state. And one of the amazing things about it is that we probably will not even know who our masters are. They'll disappear up there somewhere, And we won't know how we are controlled by them because we won't understand the psychological and the economic control mechanisms that are being applied to us. But we will live in a high-tech feudalism where our personal freedoms will be nothing but memories among the very old. That's what we're coming to for ourselves and our children. I don't want to dwell on that because it is too pessimistic. But I do want to tell you that we don't want it. As far as the realistic... Oh, thank you. As far as the realistic scenario is concerned, I think we have to look at ways and means of getting ourselves out of the mess we're in and how to make the transition to a sound economic system, to do so in such a way without triggering some kind of a cataclysmic event, which is not as easy as it may sound. I don't pretend to have all the answers to this, but in my final chapter on this study, I devised 16 steps, which I thought was a good starting point, suggestions of how we can make that safe passage. I won't bore you with the details because some of them are fairly technical, but I will tell you that I think we need to pass through three major plateaus, or have three overall objectives. One is we need to establish a real dollar. Now, this gets confusing for a lot of people because they think that these things in our pockets are dollars, or they're called dollars, but they're not. I wasn't kidding when I said Federal Reserve notes, and I meant to make a very good distinction there, because a dollar, according to the Constitution, is defined as a silver coin with a certain weight of silver in it. That is a dollar, and it comes from the word thaler, which was a Dutch coin that used to circulate in the colonies before our Constitution was written. It was a coin of uniform value, high quality, and it was our de facto money system when we drafted the Constitution. So they said, well, why create a new one? We'll just adopt the thaler, the dollar. That's how it came out, eventually the dollar. We have to return to a real dollar with silver backing and gold as an auxiliary backing, something of real intrinsic value. Then we need to phase out those old Federal Reserve notes. And then finally, we have to pay off the national debt. And it can be done, I believe, and I've laid a program forward which I think is workable. But no matter what we do, there's white water ahead, because the people that control this mechanism are not going to let go easily. One of the interesting things in this study, interesting to me at least, was that the Federal Reserve System is not the first time we had a central bank in this country. It's the third time. It's the third time. I didn't learn that in school. The first one actually existed before the Constitution. It was chartered by the Continental Congress. It was called the Bank of North America. It was a central bank. It was financed largely by the Rothschilds. Did you know that? Our bank was financed by the Rothschilds and their agents in this country. Well, it was a terrible failure. I mean, it caused inflation and people lost their savings, and so they got rid of it. And then later there was another try at it. It was called the First Bank of the United States, and that's the one that Andrew Jackson went after. President Jackson called it the Hydra-headed monster. Sort of reminded me of the creature, you know. He was going to slay the monster, and he did. They got rid of the First Bank of the United States. That was the second try at it. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because in that experience, the head of the First Bank of the United States, which is really the second central bank, the head of that bank was a fellow by the name of Nicholas Biddle. When his bank was under attack, he deliberately set out to ruin the economy so that he could create as much havoc as possible and point the finger at President Jackson and say, you see what happens when you start to take away or tamper with this wonderful institution? You're ruining the economy. And he did that deliberately. You think our present rulers in the financial world wouldn't do that? Of course they would. That's why I say there's white water ahead, no matter what we do. We have to get that in our minds. We're kind of like a fellow that's been in a drunken binge for 20 years. And when we come out of this hangover, out of this binge, it's going to be a hangover that is not going to be very nice. But if we don't come out of the hangover, we're going to die. So those are the kinds of options we have to be realistic about. Well, how do we prepare for this? I wish I were really smart so I could tell you how. I don't know how. I have 6 suggestions, which I have put in there. Common sense things that anybody can figure out, such as get out of debt, you know. The less debt you're in, the better you're going to be. And I have some very common sense suggestions of what kind of investments to choose and so forth. I urge you to take a look at those and consider them carefully, because they could make a difference on how well you weather the storm ahead, or even if you weather the storm. I want to explain, however, that I'm not one of those people that has a plan for you to make a killing out of the collapse of America. I get these newsletter offerings almost every week in the mail saying that inflation is coming, here's how you invest and get rich, you know. This is not my plan. I have no objection to anybody that wants to be realistic about inflation is coming and invest and diversify and be defensively postured in the market. But if anybody thinks they're going to make a killing and come out the other end looking and feeling good out of the destruction of America, they better have another thing coming. Because if we lose this, ladies and gentlemen, it doesn't make any difference how much money you made or where your investments were. You're going to lose it all. We have to save this free enterprise system. We have to return to a sound monetary system, and that's the best investment that we can make, is to pursue that objective. So where do we begin? We begin where we lost it, and that's in Congress. Congress got us into this mess, and they can reverse the process. All we have to do, really, is throw out the big spenders, which is not as difficult as it might seem, because when you look at Washington, we have altogether 535 people, no more, who make the laws. That's a real tiny group. Just think, the whole nation is determined by 535 people. Can't we influence some of those people if we really get out and try? We don't have to influence all of them. Actually, half of them plus 1 is 268, which is even a smaller number. If we just do it in Congress alone, that would probably do it, and that number is 435. Half of that plus 1 is really only 218. See, it gets more realistic and doable all the time. And actually, when you think about it, we don't even have to do that, because if we could affect the composition of 100 congressional candidates or actual congressmen, 100, that would do it, because the rest of those fellows up on the Hill would get the message, you know? And I'm sure that they'd be walking around saying, well, I've been trying to warn my fellow constituents about this danger for years, you know? They would suddenly become constitutionalists. Our job is to affect 100 congressional districts. That's our job, to save our nation and to save our families. It can be done. We have to start, though, with a grassroots educational campaign, as dull and boring as that may sound. That's where it has to be, because unless the people out there, unless the voters have an inkling of what's going on, there's no way in the world that a really good congressman is going to be elected. If you had the best guy in the world standing up, campaigning for office and talking about some of these issues, the public would say, huh? What's he talking about? There's no way you can elect good people without a better awareness at the grassroots level. That's why the TRIM program that you heard about here earlier is so valuable. This is a way to get to the grassroots, and it's a worked out system. It's proven. You don't have to worry about it. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. Just get those little brochures out, something as simple as that, so the average guy can see, oh, my congressman is a big spender. How about that? I didn't know that. You know, the average person doesn't know what his congressman is doing. He forms his opinion on how nicely he smiles, or how many posters he sees on people's lawns and things like that. You know, if he had in his hand the voting record, you know, this guy votes for those big spending programs. I don't think I like him. That works. We know it works. So get involved in the TRIM program. It's an easy thing to do, and it's effective. Now, beyond that, of course, you have to have a group of people that know more than just these X's and stars and the voting records. That's where the Birth Society comes in, with meetings like this, and books and pamphlets and videotapes, educational instruments that go into depth, because you need leadership. You folks wouldn't be here if you were just part of Bubis Americanus. You folks, I'm not just saying this, well, I'm not trying to compliment you to get you feeling good or anything, but it's a fact. You gave up an evening of your time to come here and to check this story out because you're concerned, and that tells us right away that you are, if you're not already, you have the potential for being leaders in your community. You're thinking people, you're concerned people, you want to know the facts. And we know from experience that for every one of you here, there are at least 10, and probably more, who really lean quite heavily on you for your opinions and your advice. And there may be a lot more than that. I think every person, whether they know it or not, can rather well influence closer to 50 people. And some of the friends I have are very influential over numbers much larger than that. So that's where the Birch Society comes in with its educational program, a deeper understanding to try and create an educational strata within the community to counteract some of this media coverage that is leading people in the opposite direction. I'm not here to pitch you on the Birch Society, but I'm here to tell you that if you don't know about it, find out about it. Attend their meetings, read their literature. I think you'd be very impressed by their program. And they need you, and you need them. The good news about all of this is that we can overthrow the government of the United States every 2 years without firing a single shot, if we'll just get out and do it. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to close now. You've been very patient, but I want to leave this thought with you, kind of wrap it all up. We have been taken in by the world's greatest scam, the Federal Reserve System. It's the world's greatest and most successful scam. And it's not just money. That would be bad enough. But the scam involves our freedoms, the future of our country, freedom of our children. And we need to do something about that. The obstacle is the fact that most people have been convinced that this topic is beyond their understanding. Congress, too, many congressmen are afraid to touch it because they don't really understand it and they don't want to admit to you that they don't understand it. And they're afraid that they're going to accidentally push the wrong button and the whole system will fly apart. You see what Epictetus has done to us. He has paralyzed us. It's time to send him back to Phrygia. It's time to convert this appearance of the fourth kind into a disappearance of the first kind. Thank you very much.